Good evening, everyone. It's a great pleasure to welcome you all here to tonight's Upper House seminar, which is being presented by one of our Carey students, Sebastian Marshall. And it's great to see so many people here, and it's welcome to everyone who is joining us online as well. Seb has been with us since around February. His arrival was timed just before the carnival party, which I think is slightly telling. But it is if with his gentle presence that he's been with us this entire semester, in fact. He comes to us from Cambridge, where he did his PhD, which was jointly supervised with colleagues from both art history and classics. And he actually has just finished his PhD, which he defended in April. Yeah. This is still April, isn't it? Yes, it is. So this month he's defended his thesis, but already he has a publication forthcoming as part of the Revecto project, and it's very nice to see various colleagues from that project here too. He at the moment is undertaking his postdoc project, which is looking at representations of Greek landscapes in the Society for the Promotion of Hellenic Studies collection, which is a huge collection of mostly slides, I think, Seb, isn't it? Thanks. And negatives. Quite a large portion of which are here at the BSA, and then the other collection is in the National Bank of Greece archive, is that right? And some of the colleagues from there are with us too. So you're all very welcome here this evening. The other thing is, the cat is behind me. Where's she gone? The Seb will be taking up at the end of his studentship here, which will be in June. He'll be taking up the new William St. Clair Fellowship at the School of Advanced Studies when he will leave here at the end of June. And we're very much looking forward to hearing your paper tonight, which is entitled Beyond the Classical Landscape, Photographs of Rural Greece from the SPHS Image Collection. Thank you very much, Seb.
Thank you for that introduction, Rebecca. Thank you everyone for coming. Great to see you all here. I shall get going without further ado. Since the earliest days of modern travel to Greece, landscape and the rural environment have been an object of fascination among foreign visitors. A preoccupation with ancient topography and picturesque views, of familiar tropes in images produced by travelers, and the nostalgic sense that rural Greece offers an idyllic contrast to urban modernity remains pervasive in tourist media today. While scholars have noted these tropes in early photographs of Greece since the late 1830s, the first photographers generally prioritized depicting antiquities rather than the landscape or rural settings in their own right. This situation began to change in the 1880s with the invention of the portable Kodak camera. Aliki Sagalu, among others, has argued that a new generation of amateur photographers began to challenge established iconographic patterns, though many such images remain little known in institutional archives. Thanks to extensive digitization by the institution that is the BSA, the Society for the Promotion of Hellenic Studies Image Archive offers a good way to explore to what extent these images depart, on the one hand, from a concern with ancient topography, and on the other, from the iconographic patterns of picturesque landscape views which predate photography. It is this combination of an overriding investment in the ancient past and a standardized way of viewing the landscape visually among Western European visitors that I refer to as the classical landscape in my title. The question mark, absent in the circulated version on the abstract, reflects the fact this research is a work in progress which has tentative conclusions begun not long ago since arriving at the British School. My interest in the Hellenic Society photo collection, largely comprising of images created between the 1890s and the 1930s, arose naturally from my PhD project, which explored ways that Greek and Anatolian landscapes were represented and marketed in Victorian sketches and book illustrations in an earlier period between 1832 and 1882. My thesis ended in a decade when travellers began to complain that Greece's rural landscapes were changing, which naturally prompted the question, what came next? The popular writer and classicist John Pentland Mahaffy, for instance, laments in 1884 that, I quote, "The day is coming when enlightened politicians like Mr. Trikoupi will insist on introducing through all the remotest glens the civilization of Europe, with all its benefits forsooth, but with all its shocking ugliness, its stupid hurry, and its slavish uniformity. When roads and rails have been brought into Greece, hundreds of people will go to see its beauty and its monuments, and will congratulate themselves that the country is at last accessible, but the real charm will be gone." Mahaffy's churlish complaint about markers of modernity deliberately positions himself as a discerning anti-tourist. Yet it also serves to reflect three key developments. First of all, for all Mahaffy's exaggeration, Greece's landscapes were changing at a new pace. The end of the 19th century was a period of population growth, the opening up of agricultural systems to global markets, large infrastructural projects, rural migration, and territorial expansion. The digging of the Corinth Canal, a program of railway building, the draining of Lake Capais, and of course the expansion of Greece's borders to include Thessaly, Macedonia, Epirus, and Crete are all landmark events in this respect. Secondly, the development of cheaper steam travel and travel companies like Thomas Cook meant that tourism from Western Europe to Greece was indeed becoming a more popular middle-class pastime. Thirdly, both of these developments coincided with a rising investment in pastoral aesthetics and rural life in Britain between the 1880s and the First World War. In this period, Britain's urban population peaked at about 80% around 1900, a level not reached in most of Europe until after the Second World War, and something like the opposite of the demographics of Greece at the time. Historians argue how widespread romantic rural nostalgia was in British society in this period, but it's generally agreed that there was a rise in this sentiment among the educated middle and upper classes, among which we can reasonably count the membership of the BSA and the Hellenic Society in this period. With these events in mind, since arriving at the school, I've started exploring the large subject of what Greece's landscapes meant to British audiences at the turn of the 20th century. To do so, I've begun exploring the SPHS image collection, comprising of over 7,000 glass and film negatives with some photographic prints and glass lantern slides, alongside searching for observations about Greece's landscapes in published sources from the period between the 1880s and the 1930s. As argued in the 2009 edited volume about the British School, Scholars, Travels, Archives, many early members who came to pursue the study of history, archaeology, and the culture of ancient Greece at this time were seduced by the powerful impact of the Greek landscape and contemporary culture. A notable amount has been written about the ramifications this had for post-antique studies and early ethnographic work in Greece, some of which gestures to photos in the Hellenic Society collection, but less has been said about how this correlated with attitudes to landscape. In what follows, I'll firstly offer some preliminary observations on how this split interest in antiquity and contemporary life informed British attitudes to Greek landscape. Secondly, I ask whether the SPH images ever depart from the iconographic patterns of picturesque landscape views which predate photography. In the first part of this paper, I'll give an overview of the archival holdings, secondary literature, and an introduction to the late 19th century tropes about Greek landscape among British travellers. For my first case study, I'll examine photos taken by members of the BSA. My second case study explores images taken by tourists and commercial photographers. And my third turns to the special case of Shirley Clifford Atchley, a longtime resident of Greece and a member of the British legation, whose donation of over 1,000 negatives is the largest single body in the archive. To begin, it's worth explaining the origins of the Hellenic Society image collection and its transferal to the BSA. Here, and indeed throughout this paper, I draw on the pioneering research completed by Debbie Harlan in the process of cataloguing the collection. Her work on British photography in Greece can be found in various publications and an extremely valuable array of archived stories, like those shown on the screen, which I would encourage you to check out if you're interested in the collection. As Harlan has shown, the collection's origins are enshrined in Rule 2, laid out in 1878 in the Hellenic Society's founding objectives. Alongside Rule 1, promoting the Greek language, and Rule 3, encouraging travel and archaeological work in Greece, Rule 2 read as follows: to collect drawings, facsimiles, transcripts, plans, and photographs of Greek inscriptions, manuscripts, works of art, ancient sites, and remains, and with this view to invite travelers to communicate to the Society notes or sketches of archaeological and topographical interest. As George Macmillan notes in his early history of the Hellenic Society, it would not be until 1889 that the collection of photographs began properly, kick-started by the donation of large reproductions of William James Stillman's photographs of Athens, which are still held by the Society in London today. After 1890, however, a growing number of members and non-members deposited negatives or photographic prints, including many scholars affiliated with the BSA. Over the years, many negatives were reproduced as enlarged prints, available for display in classrooms. From 1893 onwards, an increasing number were advertised for loan as lantern slides, again for teaching purposes. To browse the slide collection, thousands of index cards with small contact prints were created as finding aids. As the collection grew, updated catalogues of slides and lists of new accessions were regularly published in the Journal of Hellenic Studies, and here you can see a list of donations on the left to the collection by 1913, and an example of a lantern slide projector in the middle, and a sample of the index cards marked S to demonstrate that they were available as slides. It wasn't until the 1930s that donations to the collection began to decline, but over the next 30 years, the collection gradually slipped into disuse, and in 1967, it was placed in storage. By the beginning of the 21st century, the long-neglected collection had been earmarked for disposal. In 2003, the BSA acquired thousands of negatives and a few hundred slides and index cards to save part of the Greek series. The remainder of what survived was taken on by the National Bank of Greece's Cultural Foundation, the Miet Elia Archive, and a smaller number of images pertaining to Italy went to the British School at Rome. Today, the BSA possesses a corpus of around 7,300 objects, mainly negatives, while Elia holds a much larger number of index prints, 16 boxes of large prints, and an as yet undetermined number of lantern slides. Nikos Kotsimbos, who has written a valuable series of articles about the Elia holdings, has catalogued a total of nearly 15,000 small prints contained in 61 boxes. Notwithstanding the colossal work of Harlan and Kotsimbos, estimating the holdings of the collection at any point in its history is difficult, since many images have been lost or deaccessioned. With the 7,000 odd negatives now in the BSA, a fraction of a corpus that was once many times the size. The collection's former scale can be estimated from 5 negative registers held by the Hellenic Society in London, which number around 30,000 entries. When I began this project, I'd hoped to gain a quantitative sense of what proportion of these images depict scenes of contemporary life in Greece, or what is sometimes called pure landscapes, without ruins or human habitation, among the majority of depictions of artifacts and archaeological sites. However, the fractured nature of the SPHS collection makes ascertaining thematic statistics challenging. As a more modest aim, I hope to match up more of the holdings of the BSA with the collections of Elia during the remainder of my time in Athens. Beyond the work of Harlan and Kotsimbos, photography in Greece has received much valuable discussion in the last 2 decades. The bibliography is large, but when it comes to landscape, special mention must go to the following. In an important essay entitled The Invention of the Greek Landscape, Yannis Thathatos argues that before the 1880s, remarkably few photographers turned their attention to landscape, which lacked ruins or strong ancient associations. The development of the Kodak camera in the 1880s, as I've already said, gradually enabled a new generation of amateur photographers to expand the iconographic repertoire, and slowly in the final 2 decades of the century, photographers began recording ethnographic subjects, infrastructural projects, and the incorporation of new territories into Greece. However, It was not until the 20th century that rural or natural environments really began to be treated as subjects in their own right, notably in the work of the well-studied Swiss photographer Frédéric Boissonnat. Stathatos attributes the growing investment in rural environments to the yearnings of an alienated urban Greek bourgeoisie, and Iraklis Papaioannou has written in more detail about the emergence of domestic tourism in Greece, including nature societies and hiking clubs. When it came to foreign photographers, Aliki Tsigalo largely confirms this picture, with few exceptional depictions of non-classical themed landscape scenes in the 19th century, in what the works of Bartolomeo Bori, Giuseppe Belinda, Stillman, and later some of the stereographs of the firm Underwood and Underwood. The images I examine today, created between the 1890s and the 1910s, largely fall into this narrative about a gradually growing interest in photographing Greek rural environments at the turn of the century. Nonetheless, I hope to nuance it in two important ways. Whilst Stathatos is critical of the visual repetitiveness of what he describes as an idyllic and regressive pictorialism in the early 20th century, driven by the cult of the rural picturesque, I'd suggest that there is more iconographic variety than has been accounted for. Part of the difficulty comes from the nebulousness of the term picturesque, which conceals a multitude of ideas and styles. When the term picturesque was first popularized in the late 18th century, it was associated with a strict tripartite composition between foreground, middle ground, and background, with an emphasis on variety, asymmetry, and surface irregularity. Following Edmund Burke's definition of the terrifyingly rugged sublime, an example of which you can see on the right, and the placidly gentle, beautiful landscape, as can be seen on the left, the picturesque was sometimes understood as a compromise between the two. Accordingly, Fanny Maria Tsigakou has explored how Greece was assimilated either into beautiful Claudian conceptions of Italy or sublime Swiss or Scottish style landscapes. Unsurprisingly, given the divergence between these two styles, across the 19th century, picturesque comes to be used indiscriminately simply to refer to images that provide a pleasing contrast to urban modernity. More recently, Jenny Gasker has called the picturesque a means for the appropriation of Greek landscapes, a version of John Urie's tourist gaze, a mechanism to render alien landscapes proper by subsuming them into a familiar conceptual system. Beyond art history, many anthropologists and geographers have criticized the premium put by Western travelers on visual representations of landscapes, which are inherently inadequate for understanding the lived complexities of dwelling and humans' entanglement with the natural world. I want to stress here that my sources are fundamentally the work of outsiders to the landscape, who are prone to overwrite the many deeply textured meanings for the people who live and work on it. As a British visitor to Greece myself, I inevitably share this outsideness, and my personal understanding of many of these places is necessarily slight. Nonetheless, I believe that the label of the picturesque often obscures the meaning of landscape beyond mere aesthetic pleasure. Here I draw on the work of Vasso Serenidou, whose pioneering studies in Greek environmental history emphasize the interplay between romantic aestheticizing approaches and scientific or agricultural understandings of landscape as a natural resource. The complex meanings of landscape for British audiences can be seen from a sample of works on Greece from the late 19th and early 20th centuries, which for convenience I divide into three categories. The first and most conservative of the three quite straightforwardly stresses Greece's natural beauty, and to a great extent ignores contemporary life. These works place an idealizing emphasis, as John McClement declares, on the beauty of the scenery, the purity of the atmosphere, the geniality of the climate, the fertility of the plains and valleys, the grandeur of the mountains. With a similar degree of unalloyed praise, Henry Nevison writes that even imaginative people who are capable of creating for themselves scenes more astonishing and romantic than anything which nature can produce would, I think, when the first sense of difference is worn off, discover in the actual Greek landscape a quality of beauty, as well as an intensity of association peculiar to Greece alone. Here we have the romantic cliché of Greek landscape that many scholars have powerfully critiqued. At the other end of the spectrum, we find a parallel category of books which eschew to different degrees this nostalgic romanticization by focusing on the contemporary landscape. The journalist John Sargent is a key figure in this respect, whose New Greece and Greece in the 19th century, a record of Hellenic emancipation and progress, explores agricultural development, export markets, forestry regulations, draining of marshland, and road and railway construction. Similarly, in Greece under King George, the barrister Rondo Bickford Smith describes being stung by the comment of a diplomat, "You are off to study the dead and I the living, but I think you will pay attention to the living too someday," which allegedly impelled him to publish this compendium of statistics on agricultural yields and the extent of different species of tree in Greece. Finally, the journalist William Miller, whose title, Greek Life in Town and Country, sums up the urban gaze into the rural landscape with which I began this paper, also devotes his attention to the development of forestry and agriculture in what he describes as the modern epic of Greece's regeneration. His work is interesting for reflecting the tensions between the aesthetic and utilitarian approaches, as he laments, like Mahaffy, the day when Greeks, I quote, "Lovely little country will be exploited, its conditions made regular, its path smooth, its freshness spoiled." Falling to some degree between these two approaches, we find a third body of publications which combine a pragmatic concern with the contemporary countryside with an investment in Greece's ancient history. Although looking to the past, these writers go well beyond the traditional parameters of topography, understood simply as identifying the locations of ancient places. Instead, these scholars scrutinize contemporary agroecology and geography as a means to understand Greek life throughout history. Simplistic environmental determinism had long been a part of writing about Greece, but academics like Henry Fanshawe Tozer sought to nuance and professionalize this field. The next couple of generations of writers after Tozer, including Alfred Zimmern, Arnold Toynbee, and William Heitman, would develop the concern with rural economies and the environmental history. In all of these writers, we find a balance between an idealized view of Greek nature and landscape as a natural resource. Alfred Zimmern admits, for instance, his susceptibility to the sheer beauty of Greece, which inspires romance and imagination, at the same time that he emphasizes the omnipresent influence of the Mediterranean landscape on Greek life, which he discusses in scientific terms of the unproductive, the forest, the pasture, and the cultivable. Having sketched out these three broad approaches, I now turn to the SPHS photographs donated by scholars affiliated with the BSA. Many of these photographs are from excavations, which often took place at ancient sites off the tourist trail in remoter parts of the country, while others originate from more open-ended regional surveys and programs of independent travel. In both contexts, we find various images which depict neither the act of digging or ancient remains, but some of these are very obviously replicating quaint, picturesque compositions, like this example of an ornamental traveler on a donkey on the winding road. And you can see a comparison with an earlier image there. Others depict famous classical sites, albeit without ruins and shot, like this grand, deep vista of from Delphi. Others, however, depict sites unsuited to the conventions of picturesque landscape. Here in these images of Zerelia, we see a flat landscape with an absence of trees. In different ways, these break key tenets of traditional picturesque iconography. In the image on the right, there is little emphasis on changes in altitude and distant vision, no pronounced division between foreground, middle ground, and background, and no trees or foliage or interlocking spurs of hills to frame the composition. Sorry, that should be the image on the left. The image on the right exhibits a more traditional handling of depth, but making the reed bed in the foreground the center of the composition is unorthodox. The alternation of water, reeds, water, land, and sky gives the image a more abstract quality. Beyond excavations like Zerelia, it seems to have been a point of pride and a way of distinguishing themselves from regular tourists for early members of the BSA to range as widely as possible, taking souvenir photos while mountain climbing or visiting unfamiliar landscapes. The result sometimes has more of an amateurish immediacy than traditional picturesque engravings or watercolor views, which are characterized in the 19th century by the embellishment of an original sketch and careful artificial balance of curious details in a wider vista. The slightly wonky mountain view by William Halliday on the left, for instance, appears a little empty, the track strikingly bare. Elsewhere, we find figures adding interest to compositions, but alongside stereotypical ornamental Greeks in traditional costumes, we sometimes see individuals posing with a suggestion of agency, like John Baker Pinoy's Cretan gendarme escort on Thasos, Ali Ismail, who gazes directly at the camera in the centerpiece of the shot on the right. Little contextual information survives for the images explored thus far, but sometimes when photographs are reproduced in articles for the Annual of the British School or the Journal of Hellenic Studies, more can be gleaned about their significance. These views taken by Ernest Gardner of Lake Phaneos in the northern Peloponnese, for instance, serve as the starting point for a historical geographical discussion by John Baker Pinoy about the relative water levels of the lake from antiquity to modernity, where he exhaustively works through ancient and modern sources to explain the way the lake drains and fills, and how this relates to local life and agricultural practice. A concern which likely reflected the recent draining of Lake Capais to create more cultivable farmland. Strikingly, he begins the article with an appeal to picturesque farming, looking approvingly at a fustanellid harvester at his peaceful toll, but he is shocked when the corn gives place to an unpicturesque, ugly foreground of sun-cracked clay and a mere ribbon of slate-colored water, all that is left of Lake Phaneos today. We find a similarly fascinating interrelation between an investment in historical geography and picturesque aesthetic expectations in an article on excavations at the Kamaras Cave in Crete, which appeared in the British School Annual written by R.M. Dawkins and M.W.L. Lanster. As the frontispiece, the reader finds a full-page plate of sweeping, archetypally picturesque scene. The image is by the Swiss photographer already mentioned, Frédéric Boissonnas, whom Stathatos Papaioannou and Tsigalou hail as the leading light of Greek landscape photography in the early 20th century. In the accompanying text, the authors declare, for a mountain scenery which should impress the inhabitants of Phaistos and the plain of Messara, it would be impossible to find a more fitting position than that of the Kamaras Cave. There follows a description of the visible peaks in the magnificent view and an account of the surrounding ecology and agriculture. Although the article's ostensible purpose is to discuss the painted pottery discovered in the excavations, it was deemed important to start with the view as a means to talk about access to the cave and the sanctuary's significance. Before getting onto the archaeological material, we find 6 further photographs of the view taken by John Percival Droop, some of which survive as negatives. Whether they are inspired by Boissonnas before visiting the site is impossible to say, but certainly the framing trees in the foreground before the sweeping mountain backdrop mimics the Swiss photographer's iconographic priorities. Interestingly, Dawkins accompanies Droop's photos with a lament at the activities of charcoal burners who have cut down much of the forest belt on the way up to the site, and the shepherds whose goats have prevented the regrowth of trees. Vassos Serenidou, among others, has noted how deforestation in Greece was a point of acute concern for foreign visitors and the Greek state alike, both because it meant that landscapes did not match picturesque aesthetics and because mature trees were seen as a sign of profitable forest management. Joseph Botezagias and Yorgos Kostopoulos have shown how traditional uses of forest land by pastoral communities increasingly came into conflict with the Greek state's efforts to maximize timber stock in a period when larger flocks and the expansion of cultivated land reduced available pasture. Dawkins' implicit criticism of the charcoal burners and the shepherds for spoiling the view and damaging what he perceived as the natural state of the landscape is thus part of a much wider discourse, which we find repeated in William Miller, Lewis Sargent, and Bickford Smith's discussions of Greek woodlands. In most of the pictures I've shown so far, any sign of the contemporary human settlement has been avoided, preserving the illusion of the intrepid British explorer venturing out alone into the wilds of nature in Wordsworthian isolation. But this isn't true of all the images in the SPHS archive. A number of landscape views record modern settlements like these views of a village in Thassos and a monastery on Crete. More rarely, we get indications of new infrastructure as incidental to scenes of more picturesque interest, like the shot on the right by Ernest Gardner of the Viriakos Gorge from the train between Corinth and Patra. In the famous view of Meteora on the left, we can see clearly the town below and lumber being transported by rail. Amid this body of images, a notable portion go beyond incidental records of contemporary life to serve, as Harlan and Kotimbos have argued, as works of ethnographic documentation. Harlan notes that the SPHS issued a series of slide sets entitled Modern Greek Life and later Modern Greek Country Life, which depicted scenes of ploughing, threshing, shepherds, potters, traditional transport, spinning and weaving, and festivals. This interest in rural activity reflects a growing investment in the continuity, today dismissed as highly simplistic, of ancient social life and practices in the present. Nikos Politis is often invoked as the foundational figure for the field of folkloric study, in whose footsteps followed several early scholars affiliated with the British school, including William Halliday, who took this photo of philocopy on Milos. Halliday's landscape slots into a tradition of picturesque pastoral painting, which achieved notable popularity with images like this view by John Linnell during the Victorian era. In addition to the three categories of books about Greek countryside listed so far, we might add a fourth encompassing this new breed of ethnographic study. In all of these works, rural life is deeply romanticized and misleadingly categorized as changeless, often with reference to the agency of landscape. Thus, Reynolds Rod describes Greece's rural inhabitants thus: the stationary character and a marked separate individuality from valley to valley and range to range has been accentuated by the physical features of the country which they occupy. Elsewhere, Rod's idealization of rural simplicity takes on mystic tones. He writes, "There undoubtedly exists among the rural populations of this land some subtle instinct suggesting a divinity inherent in certain spots of earth of exceptional beauty, of striking grandeur, or of solitude, some close sympathy with nature, due rather to feeling than to rational process. This condescending fascination with communities perceived to live close to nature adds a new level of meaning to rural Greek landscapes for British audiences." In the remainder of this paper, I turn to images of Greek landscape produced by the figures who weren't members of the BSA. The first category of people in this respect were not long-time residents of Greece, but tourists who had some affiliation with the Hellenic society who responded to its call for donations of negatives. Most notably, a substantial portion of negatives were donated to the SPHS collection by members of the Argonaut Camera Club, a group named after a ship run by a cooperative cruising company. Debbie Harlan has written about the history of this touring organization, which offered middle-class holidaymakers educational-themed cruises around Greece, dubbed by the Times the Schoolmaster's Cruise, and later known as the Hellenic Travelers Club. Many participants were enthusiastic amateur photographers, like this unknown passenger with his Kodak Brownie camera. The tourists connected to the Argonaut Club were unable to visit remoter sites in Greece outside of the familiar itinerary of famous classical sites, and accordingly we find a series of landscapes of Tempe, Marathon, Attica, Delos, and Sphacteria. True to the schoolmaster reputation, many of these images have a straightforward topographical significance and picturesque framing, but the amateur nature of many of the photographs sometimes makes for a variety of unorthodox compositions. Occasionally, tourists experiment with a pictorialist approach, taking delight in natural features like the coastal rock formation at Pylos, or a close-up shot of the foliage on the sides of the Tempe Valley. Interestingly, many Argonaut negatives show similar priorities and compositions to those by members of the BSA, alternating between ruins, pure landscape, and scenes of contemporary life. One notable difference, however, is the more frequent appearance of people, either holiday snaps of fellow tourists like this effort to cast the battlefield of Marathon into a spot for collecting flowers, or what could be called landscape portraits of Greek country dwellers treated with a similar distancing ethnographic gaze to the images already discussed. Another body of negatives not donated by BSA members are linked in the SPHS image registers to a commercial photographic business named the English Photographic Company. Harlan has shown that the company was active between the 1890s and the 1920s and had a shop recorded first on Stadio Street and then in Syntagma Square. A number of landscapes without ruins appear in this corpus of negatives, but like the Argonaut Club images, virtually all record sites famed for their classical significance or mainstream tourist value. In some cases, this leads to the recording of unpicturesque but topographically significant locations, like these sparse views of the plain of Delphi and the battlefield of Plataea. Other times, we find lush, archetypally picturesque images, like this view of Tempe, the most celebrated example of natural beauty in Greece accessible to tourists, which finds parallels in numerous photographic views, or indeed older watercolors, like this landscape by Edward Lear. We could compare this and many other English photographic company images to an early generation of sketches, watercolors, and engravings of celebrated viewpoints, supporting the view of Stathatos and all, that when it came to commercially available images, the iconographic repertoire was often repetitive. Though we know little about the English Photographic Company, Harlan has shown that an individual named Shirley Clifford Atchley, who gave one of the largest single donations to the SPHS of over 1,000 negatives in 1921, was in fact a partner and company photographer. Duplicates between Atchley's own personal collection of negatives donated in 1921 and images linked to the English company in the SPHS registers donated in 1897 and 1913 cement the connection. Interestingly, if we compare Atchley's 1921 donation with images associated with the English company, we find his personal collection exhibits far greater variety of subjects, many of ancient sites, but also landscapes without an ancient significance, which I'll briefly discuss in the final part of this paper. Compared to the photographers discussed so far, Atchley stands out for his long familiarity with Greece. The son of a Bristol doctor, Atchley first travelled to Greece in 1887, aged 17, before pursuing a varied career first as a conjurer's assistant, an employee of the Gresham's Insurance Company, the Ionian Bank, and then the English Photographic Company. In 1897, he was a foreign correspondent with the Greek army in Thessaly and shared their disastrous retreat. By 1909, he was a translator for the British legation in Athens, and eventually he became first secretary. Here he worked until his death from heart failure in June 1936 while hiking on Mount Kyllini in Arcadia. According to his obituaries, Atchley was a Philhellene whose language skills and appearance apparently meant he could pass as Greek. In 1893, he married a woman named Anastasia Galassi from the Vlach settlement of Samarina in the Pindus Mountains, with whom he later lived in Ambelokopi, whence he regularly climbed up Imitos in Pendeli with his family. Today, he is largely forgotten, except as the author of the first monograph on Byron written in Greek, and in British horticultural circles as a prodigious hiker and botanist. His sole publication on this subject, edited after his death as an abbreviated version of a planned much longer work, is a beautiful book entitled Wildflowers of Attica. Perhaps unsurprisingly, given Atchley's enthusiasm for hiking and nearly 50 years of his life spent in Greece, he travelled more widely than most contributors to the SPHS collection, creating a remarkable corpus of photos that shows much greater technical skill and compositional fluency. Atchley was well versed in the careful framing of mountains, foliage, valleys, and rivers typical of picturesque landscape aesthetics. But here I select a couple of examples which show his range beyond this style. Atmospheric effects and light and the play of the shadow of clouds enliven photos like this depiction of the dry bed of Lake Phineos. On the right, a sliver of sky is visible down the Megaspilio Gorge, while the straight lines of the railway are juxtaposed with the interminably rugged surfaces of the cliffsides. For all the virtuosity of Ashley's negatives not associated with the English Photographic Company, it's worth noting that relatively few were reproduced as lantern slides circulated by Hellenic society, in that they didn't depict ancient ruins, so weren't of interest. A notable exception to this, however, can be found in a set of slides created by the aforementioned geographer and historian Arnold Toynbee to illustrate a lecture series on Greek life and the Greek environment, which draws heavily on Ashley's images. Here, Ashley's interest in olive cultivation and the rivers of Greece clearly aligned with Toynbee's investment in the relationship between environmental history, in relationship between nature and human life and environmental history. And these are two examples from the slide series. There's not time today to document all of the details of the photos, which reflect Ashley's specialist ecological botanical knowledge, but suffice to say that plants and foliage often appear in focus in the foreground of images, and it's not uncommon to find photographs purely focused on the forms of different species of tree in a way that clearly departs from all the images discussed so far. This ferny slope of chestnut trees or a lone portrait of a wych elm provide striking examples. Like Dawkins in the article about the forest near the Camara's cave on Crete, or William Miller, with whom he was close friends, Ashley was deeply invested in Greek fields and forests, and similarly critical of pastoral communities who inhabited them. In an article in Memoriam, the botanist Dorothy Lowe wrote, "Remember too his love of the countryside, his close observation of agriculture, his wrath at the destruction of the forests by his satanic majesty the goat." Similarly, Ashley began his introduction to Wildflowers of Attica with a plaintive note about the destruction of trees in Greece, lamenting the wholesale destruction of the woods by fire during the last 30 years, that is, fires set by pastoral grazers, and its overgrazing by those enemies of all vegetation, the goats, and in a lesser degree, to the increase of population with the consequent demands for increased quantities of fuel. His love of woodlands is certainly reflected in the number of forests he photographed, and a notable small series depicts the richly forested estate of Akhmataga on Evia, owned by a British family since 1832, who are known for promoting Western European agricultural and forestry practices. Here, the landscape likely meant something very particular to Ashley, an example of British property and stewardship, a kind of Anglo-Hellenic scenery. Beyond an interest in antiquities, agroforestry, or flowers, a tantalizing piece of evidence reveals one last meaning for Ashley's landscape photographs. A recent biography of the Canadian-Italian journalist and archaeologist Gilbert Bagnani contains an anecdote about Ashley, whose company Bagnani seems to have disliked. In a letter dated 14th of May 1922, Bagnani describes a conversation with the Greek deputy on a train from Agrionion to Autolycou in western Greece, one of the best documented regions in Ashley's 1921 donation. The deputy reportedly told him that Scratchley, that's Bagnani's nickname for Ashley, has been in the region a short while back collecting political information. The implication that Ashley was a spy is difficult to verify, and if true, it seems highly unlikely that he would have donated strategically valuable photographs to the Hellenic Society. On the other hand, the point raises the intriguing possibility of the picturesque landscape as a cover for intelligence. Rapid though my race through the SPHS image collection has been today, we may draw some broad conclusions. How picturesque these images are depends on how broad a definition you adopt of the term picturesque. If you take it simply to mean a rural contrast to urban life, then they all fall into this category. But if you take a stricter visual definition, as I've done today, with reference to the previous generation of images of the Greek landscape, then we see continuities as well as new iconographic trends in the depiction of agricultural labor, flora, and a great variety of non-urban environments. Treating these images in isolation, it's easy to dismiss them as merely an aesthetic gaze, without digging into the motivations that inform their composition and explain their appeal. Looking at the scholars, tourists, and odd professional photographers who donated these images, we find a complex nexus of meanings for understanding the landscape that range from the romantic to the scientific, the historical to the immediate, caught between an urban bourgeois fascination and equal suspicion of rural life, idealization of a static vision of natural beauty, and faith in modern forestry and agriculture's interventions in the landscape. History, above all the idealized classical past, does continue to be perceived either as visible or immanent in Greece's landscapes. But British visitors to Greece had to look through a populated contemporary landscape to see this. A minority, though a minority these photographs may be in the SPHS image collections compared to the images of ancient sites and ruins, Rule 2's stipulation of archaeological and topographical interest does not do justice to these images' variety. Thank you. And thank you to all of these people.
Very much. That was fantastic. I loved your point that was it Dawkins or Drope who said we were giving out about changes in the landscape. Archaeologists are well known for being cranky about giving out about changes in the landscape. Ironically, given what they do to the landscape, it's all their work. I have a couple of questions, but maybe I should let other people ask a question to start with. Are there any questions, or should I keep going? I wondered, therefore, Seb, if you could, so you showed a contrast of photographs. So you've got the photos by waist stroke drone at one point, and they look like the kind of landscape photos that I would take when I'm just kind of trying to get a sense of what's going on around the site. And I'm not really trying to frame it in any particular way or make it beautiful in any particular way.
Yeah.
But that seems to be then in contrast with some of the other people who are almost trying to get this sense of bucolic Arcadia from whatever Renaissance literature coming back in. Are you able to tell those differences between kind of amateur photographers, archaeologists, and people who are more serious?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. I mean, I think in all of the figures I'm looking at, they sit on a spectrum between professional and amateur that is not necessarily static. And I think in some, obviously the BSA over this period and archaeology in Greece is working to professionalize its reputation and move beyond antiquarian modes of thinking about the past. And that's obviously really important. But then these same figures can take a picture one day in a professional capacity, and then they are visitors to the landscape and they can behave like tourists as well. So I don't think you can, on an individual basis, distinguish. I think you need to think about the context in which all of these images are taken. But that's an interesting point about purely getting a sense of the site without thinking about framing it. But I think there's a blurring of professional and amateur in all of these figures, and some of the tourists who are on the Argonaut cause would probably resent being called tourists or being called amateurs, and this is a sort of spectrum they all sit on.
I really liked the context you gave for all the images and at the very start. Are there other questions from the audience? Go ahead.
I was struck by some of the images in the end where the tree seems to be, for some of the images, I mean, the protagonist. And I wonder whether this has anything to do with sort of botanical kind of considerations. I mean, you mentioned that actually it published a book about flowers and wheels.
Yeah. I think that's an interesting idea. Yeah. So with this, certainly it does seem like perhaps a portrait of an individual species would be a better way to describe the image on the right than a landscape proper and not just because of the orientation of the camera. I suppose the thing about his botanical publications is that the book is actually not published until after his death. So he never, it was completed with help from friends and colleagues at Kew Gardens in London who basically edited it subsequently. And I haven't been able to discover where he trained, so to speak, or whether this is just sort of long familiarity. And certainly he seems to be au fait with Edwardian botanical literature from the book. But yeah, it's an interesting proposition that this is more of a botanical illustration than it is a landscape proper. I think the other thing I'd say is that besides this, I've got a few more examples at the end. We also find examples where flowers crop up right in the foreground of his images, which is something that obviously not particularly in focus, but it's something of middle ground between landscape and his interest in the flowers for their own sake. Thank you.
Further questions? Right, go ahead. I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about use and beauty and where those kind of things overlap. Because a lot of these images are useful, they have other purposes, and a lot are in between, and some happened to be beautiful that were useful as well. I'm wondering if you've kind of found any correlations between them.
Yeah, I mean, the caveat I have to have with so many of these negatives is that it's very hard to tell how many people actually ended up looking at them in the end if they weren't reproduced as lantern slides. And I don't think that makes them uninteresting. I think that we can still say something about the context in which they were created and the original appeal of them for the photographer and what that meant for their interaction with the landscape. But the reality is that the Hellenic Society teaching, besides the exceptional slide collections focusing on contemporary Greek life or the Toynbee one on Greek geography, is inevitably preoccupied with the ancient world rather than the modern world. And we get these examples coming in, but a lot of these, the use is harder to determine. I think the other thing I'd say in response to that is that a lot of these were treated fairly disposably for a lot of their history. And the fact that they've all been digitized has kind of monumentalized them in a new way. And obviously we have our own age value, which we project onto them. But for all of their beauty as individual objects, they were also fragile, and a lot got destroyed or thrown away over the years. So got to think about that as well. I'm not sure if that answers your question, but thank you.
It's a bit silly out of ignorance, but I was wondering, it's a two-part question. If there is any sort of archival material, like written text, that we have to provide a little bit more of a context to part of this collection. And I'm asking this because I'm thinking when I travel, either as a tourist or for work or whatever, I mainly take pictures either for me to see when I get back home or for others to see. And I was wondering if there's any sort of context about those people trying to project back home what the kind of reflect their perception of Greece and early Greece of that time, like population and villages, and so that kind of ruined their image. So they focus more on the landscapes and perhaps ruins as opposed. I don't know if that makes sense, but is there any textual context to this that might give us an idea of?
I mean, the first thing is that Debbie Harlan has done fairly extensive research into a lot of the individuals who took the pictures. I think it's very rare that you have a kind of smoking gun of this is what I thought about this photograph and this is why I took it. I mean, in the limited time I had to work on this project, I was obviously looking at the published material, which is has some reflection, and then my connections between the books with which I began and the actual images are necessarily, that's an indirect connection, and I'm just framing the broader context rather than a personal use. I think the short answer is no. I haven't got a very direct example where someone very explicitly says why they took any one of these photographs, but that's not to say that it doesn't exist in some yet to be discovered archive for some of these figures. And I've ranged very, very broadly across lots of different people, and a next stage of this project would be to hone in on individuals much more closely to try and understand those motivations.
Have you had a chance to look at the Wace archive? And to
Not really,
connect
no.
some of his photographs that you have in the connection in the SPHS collections with his letters and diaries?
I have not, but that would be a good avenue to pursue. I mean, it's kind of artificial to view this collection of photographs in isolation, because obviously they were part of a much larger nexus of images for people connected to the PSA and tourists who pass through at the same time. And I use it for convenience of a body of sources, but that would be a good avenue to pursue.
Go ahead.
Hi.
I'm Vanessa. What I'd like to continue discussing and your process, is that it appears that the photographers are amazed by mountains and forest gorgeous, right?
Yeah.
And is this repeated photographer's work, or is this your selection of the photographs you showed us?
I think that the short answer is we occasionally get more flat landscapes, like, but not they are certainly a minority between more dramatic relief, and that's certainly part of it. I mean, the exception would be photographs of places like Thessaly or some like wider coastal areas, but it's true that you could say this is picturesque aesthetics because relief is what frames a composition, or you could, I think you're right that this is what they're working with when they come to Greece. So this is by some sense accidental. I think it's certainly a contrast to British landscapes that they grew up in.
Presumably the light in Greece is going to change.
Yeah. The light is a theme that dates right back to the beginning of the 19th century, before photography as well. Yeah.
I think Yorgos has some online questions.
Yes. Super. Many of the early photographers were familiar with the published drawings and watercolors of the earlier travelers, such as Edward Dugwell, who published 2 volumes on his watercolors in the 1920s and 1930s. Is there any indication that the early photographers were interacting with the work of their predecessors in any way?
Thank you for the question. The first thing I'd say to that is that in Rule 2 in the Hellenic Society's founding objectives, they actually anticipated having more manual graphic technologies and watercolors and sketches alongside the photographs, but the photographs rapidly became center stage. And we do have photographs of watercolors or lithographs, including works by people like Dodwell, that were then made into slides and viewed alongside the actual photographs. So certainly there's a continuity there. I kind of unsystematically put in a few examples of quite close visual comparisons between the Lear example, but you could definitely play that game with so many of these photographs. And I don't have a methodology at the moment which would systematically try and chart that correspondence between the two, but that's certainly something I'm interested in, not least because my PhD was looking at precisely that earlier generation of images. So that the continuity or non-continuity was what got me onto this subject partly in the first place.
No, but she's very interested in this Italian-Canadian biography.
Oh, yeah.
Actually, one more comment. From French, I think somewhere taken as 80 memoirs, and it's certainly true of the extensive photographic archive of the Wasp embroidery collection in Liverpool, but apparently it's cataloged in the sky.
That's his grand.
Yeah, aid memoir, that's a good another functional aspect that I didn't discuss at all, but yeah, certainly that's a context for these images.
Who, what's the name of the Canadian author who referred to scratch?
Oh, he's called Gilbert Bagnani. I forget the name of the scholar who's written the study of him. It came out in 2021. I can send it afterwards if that's WRC. Yeah. Oh, it's John Bennett. It's a very slight reference, and I don't know what the archival sources are, but obviously the biographer has access to Bagnani's letters and actually pops up very briefly and disappears again.
Yes, thank you very much. It was exciting to see all this and hearing and commenting on it. And I was wondering, you said at the beginning, and when you commented on their writings, that they wanted to present the living Greece. And looking at the photographs, I wonder how much of the living Greece do we actually see? In a way, they remind me of photographs of ruins, but because most of them are empty of people, or if you find people, they stand like figurines in front of an empty landscape. So instead of having the monumental Greece of the ruins, you have another kind of monumental Greece. So how much do we really see of the living Greece they say they want to discover? Do they photograph any churches? Do they photograph people working the land? Maybe. In villages, people working in the villages. Maybe it's what you selected to present to us, but I saw a contrast between the living Greece and the photographs I have seen so far.
That's a really good point. Yeah, the answer in short is that occasionally you do find examples beyond things like the threshing, or go through it. Beyond things like this, there are more examples. So you get, for example, workers at a current processing factory, or you get other examples of rural labor, but these are quite a small minority, and often they play into quite a misleading orientalized vision of Greece that is necessarily not living is too strong to describe how stereotypical it would be. I suppose living is perhaps the wrong word, and a version of the contemporary would be a more neutral way to describe the version we get. I thought the examples I chose today were purely for a kind of generic, having a wider vista of the countryside in the background, but we have a few of these examples in the collection, and they go into the slide, lantern slide series for modern Greek life, for instance. Definitely a minority, yeah.
Any other questions? Go ahead.
Thanks, fantastic paper as well. So I was wondering whether these photographers were informed of contemporary Greek literature. I mean, from the 19th century through to the mid-20th century, romantics, be they persons like Pericles Yiannopoulos or modernists such as Sebastian, present a fascination with the Greek landscape as the ultimate expression of the reborn Greek nation. So I was wondering whether you had something similar going on with Spotties on landscapes and so forth.
That's a really interesting correspondence. I think the short answer is that I don't know enough about the reading habits of any of these individuals. I think the only person I can say with confidence would be Ashley, who was fluent in Greek and doing a little bit of research into a figure who he acknowledges in the introduction to his Life of Byron. This figure is a prominent translator of English works into Greek as well, who helped him with it, and it seems likely that this is speculative. I would assume he had a familiarity with contemporary Greek literature, at least by the way he's described as being au fait with Greek current affairs in Athens in his obituaries. But I'm afraid I can't give you a better answer for the tradition of Greek writing about landscape in this period. But it's a really good question.
So just a very quick question. So in terms of the camera technology that they had at the time, and related to the question about what they were taking pictures of, were they restricted in terms of, say, taking pictures of people working or people, I don't know, dancing?
In terms of the exposure time and the actual, again, I don't know the exact exposure time for the small portable cameras in this instance, but I think this is less of an issue by the time we get to the early 20th century. It's difficult to tell exactly what model of camera these individuals had, and I don't have at present the specialist skills to be able to determine from the negatives alone to work back to what it was, but that would be a factor in having a static vision of a rural vista and having activity and life in it.
So